Okay, can you see it all right?
Yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Stephen, for that introduction, and thank you for the U of IC team for your presentations last week. I had a chance to listen to them, and I think they were really good. So I'm going to focus on part of my dissertation research, particularly focusing on the role of community and sense of place in risk perceptions of carbon capture and storage, or CCS. So I'm going to go over those two terms more in just a minute, but first I'm going to give you a quick overview of the technology because it is still relatively unknown, but it's really important to understand what it is to fully understand how the character of the technology affects the views of residents. So CCS is a technology that is most often paired with fossil fuel energy systems to reduce the amount of CO2 that is being released into the atmosphere. The first step is to capture the carbon dioxide from a large point source emitter. The CO2 is then separated from the other emissions, it's compressed, and then transported to an area that is suitable for storage. The CO2 is then injected deep underground where it is theoretically stored there indefinitely. There is an additional purpose for the injected CO2, which is called enhanced oil recovery, and this becomes important for one of my case studies. It's where you inject the CO2 into a depleted oil field, and that allows more oil to be recovered. So carbon capture and storage has encouraged a new term, not under my backyard. It's increasingly recognized that a major showstopper for CCS is public support. We've already seen this throughout the world where there's been protests and failed projects such as in Barron Direct, Greenville, Ohio, and Critis, Alberta, which is one of my case study examples. So there still needs to be studies examining public understanding, partly because there are so few projects that are underway. And the studies that have been completed have not taken into account residents' sense of place or community attachment and how those factors into risk perceptions. So a little bit about terminology here. Place attachment refers to the positive emotional connection someone has with familiar locations such as the neighborhood or an area. An individual has more complex relationships to the environment than just living in it. People form an identity and an attachment to the area. We've seen this in other examples where place has been a factor in risk perceptions of energy development, such as wind turbines. A lot of research has focused on the visual aspects of an energy system, but CCS is a unique case study because oftentimes there's very little visual impact on the landscape. And when I say the importance of community, I not only mean the economic benefits or detriments the development brings to a community, but also any impacts on social bonds or community well-being. So I see these two factors falling under two main categories of the framework: the character of technology, as well as the governance and context, particularly the community context portion of it. So for this presentation, I'm going to focus on two primary questions. How do locally affected populations view CCS, and how do community and place variables affect risk perceptions? So I completed case studies in 3 Western Canadian communities, and I'm only going to focus on 2, one that supported CCS and one that opposed a carbon storage project, because it's a really good comparison. So the first project is Weyburn, Saskatchewan. This project has played an important role in the development of CCS as it's one of the earliest demonstration sites and one of the world's largest. Since 2000, roughly 2.5 million tons of CO2 per year have been transported by pipeline from a coal gasification plant in Beulah, North Dakota, and injected in the Weyburn and Midale fields for the dual purposes of enhanced oil recovery and carbon capture and storage. In Critis, Alberta, there was a proposal for a small research project, only 600 tons per year. And just to give you a little bit of a comparison, in Weyburn, Saskatchewan, they are injecting about 6,000 tons per day. So it was much, much smaller. It was going to be managed by the University of Calgary, just outside of the city of Calgary, and the purpose of the project was to undertake research on measurement, monitoring, and verification, and to provide training to students and industry. The project met with a lot of public opposition from the community, and the university canceled the project. So I completed in-depth individual and small group interviews, interviewed members from the general community as well as representatives from those working in oil industry, farmers, business owners, as well as local government officials. I stayed in each community between 4 to 6 weeks. I went to community meetings, events, and talked to as many of the local people as I possibly could. So I'm going to go over just some of the general findings. In Weyburn, 36 of the 38 residents viewed CCS, or enhanced oil recovery, as positive. Carbon injection was seen as something that sustained and kept their community alive. It brought jobs and economic growth, increased oil production, and it brought positive perceptions to the area. Many people commented on how Barack Obama knew where Weyburn, Saskatchewan was, because when he came to Canada on his first trip, he had talked about developing clean coal technology. So not only would it sustain their community, but many of the smaller communities surrounding Weyburn. And I'm going to read a quote from a municipal government worker. "Every town I have visited is doing a new subdivision. Communities that do not have the oil patch are dying, and the only growth business in the area is the funeral homes." So the oil industry was not only seen as beneficial to the community, but many members of the community actually worked for the company, and they saw industry, or Cenovus, as part of the community. It was considered place enhancing. Farmers and landowners in the area saw oil as part of their land and something that they were used to, and something that would sustain their ability to continue living in the area because of the additional revenue from oil. Oil development was perceived as a source of pride and indicated the wealth in the area, and therefore it didn't affect sense of place at all. It rather enhanced it. And another quote from a farmer here said, "I'd rather see 100 wells or CO2 injection sites on my family's land than to lose it to the bank." So in Priddis, the results were very different. This was the place where the carbon storage project was opposed. The project was perceived as something that could cause fights among residents because there were already fights with other developments in the area. It was seen as something that may promote growth and promote industry in the area. This was something that they did not want. So this was very different than the Weyburn case study. People actually banded together to protect the land in a natural state, and this actually created a community bond, something that actually brought people together. Priddis residents saw their place as natural and undisturbed. There was no industry there. People had moved there for that reason, and it was perceived that it was untouched and natural. The storage project was perceived to perhaps, or that it had the potential to harm wildlife, create noise and traffic. The most common quote was, "This was not what the land was meant for." Therefore, they were willing to protect the land in their area and the idea that their place was untouched and undisturbed, even from a very small research project managed by a university. And I have a quote from one of the ranchers. "It's the way that I was brought up. It's meant to be kept raw and natural. A lot of people that live out here now feel very strongly in the same way. I think I'm more that way because that's how my dad thought. So I've been taught to keep it that way." So support for the CO2 injection varied in each community, and community and place factors factored into the opposition or support of CCS in each area. In Weyburn, the oil industry was seen as part of the community, and in Priddis, it was certainly viewed as external from the community. In Weyburn, people saw oil industry and the developments associated as part of the land. They liked the look of the developments in the pump jacks and the CO2 injection sites. In Priddis, place was natural, untouched by industry. So local community context matters. When examining public perceptions or when stakeholders are choosing a location for a development, they must look at the community and the context in which these energy systems exist in. So that was it for me.
Okay, thanks, Amanda. All right, well, we're going to hold questions until the very end, and I'm going to switch the presentation back to my screen. Ruth Klinkhammer. Show my screen. Sorry. for speaking out loud here with you. All right. Sorry, I should have had my screen set right up at the beginning. I'm going to now speak about the two case studies that we've done here at through Trent. One in much more depth than the other, and that's the first one on wind turbines in Ontario, and the second on Muskrat Falls in Labrador. And then Lawrence, of course, will finish with a discussion of community energy planning in Nunatsiavut, which is in Labrador. So the first piece is looking at the competing rationalities of wind energy and wind turbines in Ontario. And this, as I mentioned, is a project with myself and Adam Greer as part of his master's degree, and James Knott, who was a research associate on this project. So there's been a significant growth in wind energy in Ontario since the introduction of the Green Energy and Economy Act, which had a feed-in tariff, and it's one of the first feed-in tariffs in North America that it pays a premium price to generate and feed green electricity into the grid once you have a contract with the Ontario Power Authority. Part of the Green Energy Act, it was an omnibus bill, but one of the features of it was that municipal planning was elevated. The decisions were elevated to a provincial authority, and those planning and environmental assessment approvals were then done through a renewable energy approval and a facilitated office of renewable energy approvals. If there were appeals under the Renewable Energy Act, the renewable energy approval, they were heard by the Environmental Review Tribunal, and it shifted the onus on the appellant to show harm. And so that it was a subtle shift in terms of the appeals for these projects. There was also within the Green Energy and Economy Act a local content requirement for building new technology, and that's been challenged at the World Trade Organization. So these were some of the key features of the Green Energy and Economy Act. There was also some effort to enable community ownership and First Nations partnership and ownership, but really they weren't given that much priority, and certainly there was some difficulty in terms of communities accessing capital and getting their projects built. Some effort was changed in that last fall in a second version of the feed-in tariff, but generally the storyline hasn't changed. So the effect of this is that most of the development that's happened, significant capital has been deployed to build wind turbines and solar farms, but largely wind turbines in the province of Ontario. Most of that capital has come from multinational firms such as Florida Power and Light and Samsung and others that are able to move on these projects quickly. One of the key features then to note is that social resistance in rural Ontario has resulted. And so these are some photos to show some of the protests and things that came about, including a significant opposition that was targeted towards the provincial Liberal government in the October 2011 election. And there's some discussion and some possibility that maybe some rural seats were lost because of certainly the campaigning by some rural opponents. And so this is a series of grassroots, I guess, community resistance to wind energy being deployed within rural areas. The strategies of wind opponents have included direct political action by aligning themselves very closely with the Conservative opposition in Ontario, litigation and legal appeals through the Environmental Review Tribunal in particular, where, again, the onus is on the appellant to show harm, efforts to slow the approval process from everything of disrupting legally mandated open houses such that they don't happen in the legally required way, efforts to shape the knowledge around wind turbines and the impacts of wind turbines, particularly around the health impacts. So there's been a number of studies that have been published by well-known opponents of wind turbines in the peer-reviewed literature that are now attempting to shape the knowledge. And then also a significant communication effort. And much of this communication, interestingly, has been managed through social media. So that the existence of WordPress blogs and Twitter and Facebook has had a significantly enabled the opposition community groups to coordinate their efforts and to exchange ideas very quickly. And so that's been a key aspect of this. So to come back to the conceptual framework that we have for comparing some of these projects, or these case studies, we have the character of engagement, the governance and context, and the character of the technology. And I'm going to look at each of these in the context of wind in Ontario. So the technology, wind turbines are quite familiar to most people. And so I think that that's something to note, is that people know immediately what a wind turbine is and how it operates. But they aren't as familiar with this idea that there might be health risks associated with a wind turbine. And so that's something that certainly exists in terms of the possibility that maybe a wind turbine has a different noise frequency or a different type of noise that may create some annoyances in a small percentage of the population, and that may have some health impacts. So there are real health risks. They're not, I wouldn't consider them significant, but they've certainly been amplified through a lot of the discussion. So this is a social amplification of many of the health risks, including the notion of wind turbine syndrome that's emerged, which is a constellation of impacts to human health. There's also the issue in terms of wind turbine technology that differs from, say, carbon capture and storage, that it's a very visual technology, that you see it on the landscape, the scale of it, and the increasingly large scale of turbines now, the 2 megawatt and larger turbines are significant on the landscape. And also the low density of wind energy means that we have a lot of them. And so the rate of development then is fast. And this is a map showing you just the western part of Ontario on Lake Huron, where these are all turbines that are proposed. And so this is a rural area with a number of cottages immediately along the shoreline of Lake Huron that anticipates significant growth in the number of turbines. And so that rate is large. There's also the function that this energy is serving. And there's a lot of discussion that it's enabled Ontario to get out of coal, to close Nanticoke, and possibly, what is the wind energy actually replacing is certainly a question that's been raised by a number of opponents regarding the variability of the wind electricity. But to note, this is not to be export, this is for endogenous consumption within the province. In terms of governance and context, within the Green Energy Act, the government of Ontario is now seen as a booster of wind energy. It's not a neutral arbiter or regulatory body because of the nature of the Green Energy Act. That the opponents certainly feel that it was largely written by renewable energy proponents, and so the government has an issue in terms of their credibility as a regulator, I think, on this. Also, the wind projects are largely being driven by foreign capital, not by public or community ownership. And a lot of the wind energy firms are small startups. In terms of getting a feed-in tariff contract with the Ontario Power Authority, you can be a small player. But now we're seeing a lot of consolidation as the sector matures. And so there's a lot of turnover in the industry, each company may not have a lot of reputation as they enter into a community in terms of their engagement. And so the industry is having there's a significant change in the industry itself, in the sector. There's also a governance piece here which goes to the exchange of costs and benefits. And so landowners are compensated for hosting a turbine. If you have a piece of land, you're given compensation by the wind energy company for hosting that turbine. But if you live nearby, but are not hosting a turbine, you don't receive anything. So you might have the same kind of impacts as, say, a landowner, but not receive anything. There is some community compensation mechanisms, such as this Haldeman Community Vibrancy Fund, where municipalities have negotiated with various wind energy firms for essentially a payout to the municipal government. And the wind sector has done that voluntarily because there's no expectation that they do that at this point from a government standpoint. But there has been some effort to seek other forms of compensation from wind turbines industry. Now, in terms of the engagement around wind, I think our assessment and analysis of this is that elevating the consenting and planning process to the provincial level has elevated the scale of the resistance. So what was pre-Green Energy Act, a number of local community groups resisting a community project, has become a provincial scale of resistance. And there's also a loss of the mediating role of local planners in actually handling some of the local conflicts. So finding some common ground between developers and opponents around a siting decision. So local planners now and local politicians simply throw up their hands and say, well, it's not our choice, it's not our decision, and they turn and point fingers at the provincial government. And so I think that context piece that's so important, and was, as Amanda said, is so important in terms of carbon capture and storage, is lost when we elevate it to the provincial level. So certainly the elevating of this was an effort to streamline the approvals process and make it more certain. But I think that in the long run, this has backfired on the industry. The other aspect of this is in terms of the character of engagement, is that the consenting and planning process is one that is necessarily secretive before you receive a feed-in tariff contract as an industry. If your firm is seeking a feed-in tariff contract, you're trying to maintain some confidentiality with landowners around the leases and where you're seeking, where you're planning to do this, because others might be doing the same thing. So you don't want to lay your cards out on the table until you have the contract with the Ontario Power Authority, at which point the regulated engagement activities kick in. And so this the challenge with this is that communities understand very quickly through word of mouth that there are wind projects planned, and indeed in some of the one of the cases that we've looked at, one of the communities went door to door before there was any public engagement, knocked on everyone's door and asked if anyone had signed with a lease with a wind energy firm. And when people shrugged their shoulders and said, no, we haven't signed, we can't say, they quickly identified where the wind projects were going and organized their resistance based on that. So the second part of this is that engagement that's legally mandated and prescribed by government largely is followed to the rule, and is quite ineffectual because these projects are seen as a done deal by the community. There's no depth to the engagement. It's simply open houses with information that tells people what will happen, rather than an in-depth discussion about what could happen, or what are the possibilities and what are the potentials. And so that kind of legally mandated consultation is certainly problematic in terms of having a deep and sincere and authentic conversation about some of these technologies in context. So that's some of the things that we've looked at with wind. Here's actually just a slide showing the legally mandated engagement process around renewable energy in Ontario, and you can see it's very prescribed in terms of the notice that goes out, and then the time frame for people to respond, the first public meeting, and the nature of those meetings, and how what has to happen, how draft reports have to be made public. So it's very prescribed, and most firms simply meet the letter of the law, which can be challenging in terms of a community's desire to actually engage on these things. All right. So the second case that we've looked at, and certainly in less detail, was with myself and with a research associate, Matt Brady. And it's the Muskrat Falls large-scale hydro project in Labrador. And this is the Lower Churchill, the development of the Lower Churchill River, which the Upper Churchill was the main project that has fed for many years the electricity into Quebec, and Hydro-Quebec resells to New York and New England states. So this is an effort to build a new development and a new transmission capacity for Newfoundland and Labrador, so that they can change their own power system and also export some of that electricity both to Nova Scotia and to the New England states. So it's a large project, a large large-scale hydro project, 824 megawatts, which is about a fifth of the size of the Upper Churchill Falls, but to put it into context, but also, still very large project. And so you can see on this figure the new transmissions that would be built, and then an undersea transmission corridor from the island of Newfoundland to Nova Scotia, to Cape Breton, that would enable that electricity to be exported to Nova Scotia and to the New England states. So it's a fairly complex and large project to consider. And it's also should note that phase 1 is Muskrat Falls, and phase 2 would be a second possible development at Gull Island, which would be about 2,000 megawatts. This wouldn't be in the next handful of years, but would be down the road, an anticipated project. So the story is that this is an 824 megawatt, $7.7 billion project, and 40% of the energy would be used by Newfoundland, 20% would be used by Nova Scotia, and the rest would be sold to other markets. So it's a joint project between Nalcor and Emera. It would involve new transmission. In anticipation of this project, in 2008, the government of Newfoundland signed an agreement in principle on a comprehensive land claim with the Innu Nation, and also an impact benefit agreement. And so that was in anticipation, really, of this project. In 2010, the Lower Muskrat development was proposed by Nalcor and Emera. And then in March 2011, Prime Minister Harper, in the middle of an election, announced a loan guarantee pledge from the federal government for part of the loan that would be required to develop this project. In 2011, in August, the capital cost estimates were released for this project. At the time, it was estimated about $6.2 billion. And there was an environmental assessment panel that found that there would be severe adverse impacts associated with the project, and they weren't convinced that it was the best way to move forward. In 2012, in March, the Public Utilities Board of Newfoundland refused to clarify whether Muskrat Falls was the least cost supply option for ensuring new supply for Newfoundland. And so that both of these things created, there's an environmental concern around the project, and then there's a cost concern. You can see essentially from the August 2011 and the March 2012 decisions. In April 2012, the government of Newfoundland and Labrador ignored their Public Utilities Board and hired instead Manitoba Hydro to review any further information on the project, and sought basically to have Manitoba Hydro confirm their intuitions on this. And then in September 2012, the Inuit, which are not part of the land agreement, the New Dawn Agreement, started to investigate some of the construction, and they have found that construction had already been proceeding. And so there was a significant resistance movement that emerged from that as well. So I'm going to just then connect some of the project in terms of the conceptual framework for comparison that we have. In terms of the governance and context, this story has enormous history in terms of the Upper Churchill and the grievances that Newfoundland has with Quebec over the low cost at which they sell the power to Quebec, and then the profits that have been made from Quebec's reselling of that electricity. There's also questionable economics associated with this project, and the concern that it's a potential white elephant, that it's going to be significant capital costs for which the government of Newfoundland will be stranded. There's the other aspect of this loan guarantee from the federal government and the province of Quebec's unanimous unhappiness with this loan. There's also, in terms of governance here, the relationships between the government of Newfoundland and Labrador with the Innu Nation and the Inuit, who the Innu Nation has the Muskrat Falls development is on their territory. The Inuit is not, their territory does not include the Muskrat Falls, but they're downstream of Muskrat Falls, and so they would feel and be impacted by the downstream aspects of this. So I give you this quote from Todd Russell, who's an Inuit leader. Transmission lines will cut through the heart of our territory, yet our people we'll still be forced to use diesel generators and have higher electricity rates. We may get temporary employment, we may see a brief increase in economic activity, but we know all too well that those benefits are short-lived. The destruction and negative impacts that we will endure will be with us for generations to come. And that goes to the character of the technology. Down at the bottom here of the slide, you see the past transmission impacts from large-scale hydro that we know all too well, including methylmercury impacts in terms of land and rights and title to land. So the Inuit have concerns and legitimate concerns around this project that are not being addressed at this point. But other aspects in terms of the character of the technology that some environmentalists have certainly been supportive of this is the potential to close a thermal generation station, an oil thermal generation station, Hollyrod, that would have greenhouse gas benefits. And so there is some environmental support for that. There's also the idea that this new generation will enable and support new economic activity, including mining, and that the transmission access to the U.S. markets and to Nova Scotia begins to address some of the challenges around this historical grievance with Quebec. So the technology itself, both the idea that this large-scale hydro can both solve problems, but that it will create problems that we know all too well. I think we can see some of these tensions there around large-scale hydro. Now, the nature of the engagement on this project has been tremendously frustrating in my view. That the Innu were certainly engaged early on with this New Dawn deal and through the land claim and the impact benefit agreement. The Inuit have not been engaged on it, and so that's very problematic to me. There's also this clear sense that by opponents of the project that the province has fast-tracked it, and I think it's fair to say that with these large kind of projects that they become very much a political statement about as much about the costs and benefits and the rationale, the technical rationality and the economic rationality for a project. It becomes a statement of provinces coming of age or a jurisdiction's coming of age. And so the province has, this certainly has the sense that it's fast-tracked the project by ignoring the environmental assessments, the findings, and ignoring its own Public Utilities Board. So those are significant concerns around that. All right, well, I've gone through those quickly. I think that's my acknowledgement slide. So of course, the project was funded by Carbon Management Canada, and some of the research has been funded by the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council. So with that, I'm going to stop and turn the screen over to Lawrence Keat, and I have to unmute Lawrence and let Lawrence tell us about the follow-on project or the related project in Labrador, Nunatsiavut government. Okay, so Lawrence, I'm turning the screen over to your computer.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Great. Can you see my screen?
I'm not seeing it yet.
Okay, do I have to click the show my screen possibly? I think I do.
There we go. Great. Okay, so we'll go for about 10 minutes there, Lawrence, and we'll
great.
have questions.
Okay, so my name is Lawrence Keat, and my research is on energy resilience in the Canadian Arctic and subarctic. I'm just working. Sorry, in my screen, I can't see my screen fully.
Okay, that's fine. We see you though. We see your screen.
Okay. Part of it's cut off here. Okay, there we go. So yeah, in specific, I'm looking at the role of community energy planning in creating sustainable northern Indigenous communities. And I am at the front end of my research. I've just finished my coursework for an MA in Sustainability Studies. And so now I'm just entering the research phase now. Can you see the second slide? It clicked okay?
No.
didn't. Okay.
There we
No?
go.
Okay. Sorry, technical difficulties. Okay, so this map shows all the four Inuit land claim settlement areas in northern Canada. My personal experience has been working in the past number of summers up in Nunavut, in Ellesmere and Baffin, and also in Greenland. And I became sort of acutely aware of the energy poverty situations throughout much of the north. And I was working there, and then I came to Trent as a renewable energy consultant, so interested in this part of the north. Our focus now is in Nunatsiavut, which is in the northeastern part of the Arctic. There's 5 communities there, Inuit communities on the coast, east of the area Steve was talking about. The slide has changed, yes?
Yes.
Okay, good. This is a blow-up now of Nunatsiavut. The land claim settlement area is the dark tan area to the north, and there's a Torngat Park in the green on the north. The red area is the land awarded to the Inuit in terms of ownership by their land claim settlement that came through in 2005. So they have self-governance, and they own the areas in red. And the 5 communities range from Nain in the north to Rigolet in the south. The rationale for the project is based in the energy poverty situation that's rampant throughout Canada's northern communities. Energy poverty is anything defined as anything where the household income is greater than 10% of the household income is spent on providing energy for the home. We don't have exact figures yet, but it's looking like Nunatsiavut is at least twice that figure. So, and that's complicated, of course, by the isolation of all of the Arctic communities, the Arctic climate, and limited infrastructure, and challenges of importing infrastructure ideas from the south and placing them in an area of harsh winters and permafrost. So things tend to last fewer than 10 years up there in terms of housing infrastructure before breaking down completely. Nunatsiavut is in a position of 100% fossil fuel dependence for their energy. They all of their electricity comes from diesel, so each village has diesel generating plants just outside of the village, and there's local air quality issues associated with that. And of course, they're slave to the high fuel prices, whatever price the fuel is loaded at, and the fuel comes up the coast once per year in a large tanker shipment, and is dropped at each community. They're also vulnerable to fuel shortages and to harsh winters because of the fossil fuel situation. For heating, they're dependent on fuel oil and wood, and it tends to be a mix of the poorer people can't afford the fuel oils, so they'll range far and wide. In the case of Nain, more than 70 kilometers to look for the nearest wood over poor shifting sea ice conditions. So it's not a great situation. And because of that, there's low resilience in the communities. If anything at all happens, like a harsh winter has happened in 2010, they'll often run out of fuel for heating, so people were burning their porches and outbuildings, and they'll be in a situation of many brownouts. They can't run different appliances at the same time and that sort of thing. So this is a region that fought 40 years for their autonomy, but they're constantly looking south, so it diminishes their self-reliance that they fought for. And finally, it's an urgent priority for the Nunatsiavut government just released a Sustainable Communities Initiative in 2012, and they identified energy security as one of their top priorities for that. So they actually approached my co-supervisor with Steve Hill as Dr. Chris Fergal, and they approached him and asked for this work to be done on community energy planning in the hope that it could help them pull themselves out of the energy poverty that they find themselves in. So for historical context, in terms of our conceptual framework, I'm being in the early stages, I'm looking more at the context, the governance and context, and the character of the engagement. So I just wanted to give a little bit of a review of the the legacy, I guess, of the energy policy in Newfoundland and Labrador. and it can all be summed up by Churchill Falls, which is a massive project in the 1970s that Steve alluded to. It was provincially driven, and there was no engagement. It wasn't even an attempt at engagement. It was just sort of broached suddenly upon the Innu whose land it passed through. So there was never any significant economic benefits for the people in the province, and in fact, the Quebec-Newfoundland deal that Steve was talking about, for every million that's gone to Newfoundland, 19 million has gone to Quebec because they signed a contract until 2040 for a fixed rate in order to pass it through Quebec. So there's a lot of enduring political bitterness there. The environment, of course, was completely altered, and the massive falls was reduced to a trickle. And there was never any compensation for the Innu, and certainly no warning that it was coming. It's just it's a little bit like the Muskrat Falls now. And their ancestral lands and burial sites and such were completely destroyed. So that left an atmosphere of deep mistrust for the province. And that brings us to the present, where we're talking about Nalcor being the monopoly now for energy supply in the province. They're a provincial crown corporation, and the nature of their engagement has sadly also been tended to be, Steve mentioned done deal. So here's what's going to happen to you, and how do you feel about it, rather than any significant engagement from the community level. Muskrat Falls is less than 200 kilometers from the Nunatsiavut coast, but there's never been a talk at all about putting a landline over to the Inuit communities. So they receive no benefit and no power from this huge project. And there has been deep opposition all along from both the Inuit and the Innu. Currently, Nalcor is conducting site assessments for wind and run-of-river in the communities, the 5 communities, which sounds good, except that there has similarly been no engagement with those communities about those projects. And so the people were sort of peripherally hopeful that maybe this would be the start of a brighter energy future. But recently, Nalcor informed them that they were doing the site assessments, but were they to be implemented, there'd be no actual change to the rates that the folks there would pay. So it wouldn't directly affect their energy poverty situation. So that's the context to community energy plans. And the reason I wanted to talk about that is because the sort of wholehearted nature that the government, the Nunatsiavut government, is embracing community energy planning ideas with. So the reason for that, community energy planning is a bunch of folks from the community sitting down with the government and with utilities, and it's a community-driven process. So they actually have a say and a stake and an ownership in their energy future. So it's different right from the beginning in terms of there's an inherent deeper depth of engagement there. So more ownership right from the outset. Community energy plans tend to focus first on energy efficiency and conservation, but they provide a framework for setting a 2, 5, 10, 20-year long-term goals for gradual implementation of local and renewable sources of energy. And as a result, you diversify your power mix. And as a result of that, you increase your resilience, which is the piece that Steve and I are looking at. It goes much more hand in hand with the autonomy that we spoke about in the land claim settlement. So you're enhancing your community's self-sufficiency because you have local supply of energy. My initial research is right now in the summer. I'm conducting a lit review with the end goal of providing a best practices document to there's a Nunatsiavut Regional Energy Security Working Group that Steve will be sitting on, and I'll be advising with this best practices document. We're going to be looking all summer at a series of community energy planning in northern communities. It's mostly in northern BC, where it's mandated in British Columbia, and also in Northwest Territories are the best examples so far. And we'll be providing them with, excuse me, cases that have worked and projects that have been implemented, and sources of funding, and different technological options. So my lit review also looks at energy resilience literature and northern community engagement. And there's a piece that I feel is really important, and it's what brought me to the North, and certainly I think it's often ignored in terms of spirit and connection to the land. So that's so I want to make sure that we address that when we're engaging with the working group and with the communities up there, just to honor that perspective. Next fall, we begin the field research, so I will be presenting that best practices document to the working group. And from then, we're going to look at what we still need to find out, and parameters for an options analysis to move forward a few months past that time. And then go back to Trent and work on those knowledge gaps and the options analysis, and present the findings of that a few months later in the winter. Part of the future research is really going to depend on the reaction of this working group to what we're saying. So I'm a little light on the details of what's going to happen beyond that, except that we're hoping to initiate the community energy planning process in one community at least, and study that process and its effectiveness, and identify next steps. I just wanted, for research methods, I want to focus you down to the focus group. It's initially an appointed group by the Natsavik government. It's an energy security working group based on the mayors from the 5 communities and energy experts, utility providers, government members, and professors from Memorial and Trent. But there's key stakeholders from the community, and their goal in this, as in it arose directly from their Sustainable Communities Initiative, which is a multi-year process of teasing out the needs of the communities. So it's going to be very much a two-way, bottom-up and top-down effort. And it's a consensus-based government, and so the working group is also consensus-based. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Lawrence.
Yeah.
Okay, what I'm going to do is change my slide back to me, be the presenter here, and then I'll just have a couple of closing thoughts, and then open it up for just question and discussion for the last 10 or so minutes. So I think you see my screen. So some of the key questions, key lessons, I think, going forward. These are broad at this point, but this is we're still doing some of the comparison here. We need to think about this in the weeks and months to come. But I guess for me, the fact that there are competing rationalities for any new energy project, and that carbon is but one of those rationales for supporting or rejecting a new project. And indeed, as we know, in terms of the climate change policy literature and policy making, that climate is not a concern for many people, and carbon is not a concern for many people. So carbon's but one of those rationalities, and there are many others for reasons that people may support or reject a project. I think Amanda's point that context matters is central to this. At a very bottom-up, from a very bottom-up standpoint, it really matters how this is done, where it's done, the nature of the technology, the nature of the project, and so that there may not be any magic, wholehearted solution to what we're challenged with. But I think that it's fair to say the proponents of any kind of low carbon energy project must expect legitimate social concerns to new projects, and they must then be prepared to meaningfully address these in advance of the project and likely throughout its operating life. Broad and deep engagement, the kind of engagement that we would like to see, doesn't guarantee that we'll see success, but I think it's fair to say that a shallow and narrow type of engagement will facilitate social resistance. And the last is this idea of place and place connection that Amanda mentioned. I just added that bullet in. the idea that I think the amenity value of a landscape, or our notions of the land and our notion of these resources as either a notion of the land and water as a resource for economic development, or as some kind of ideal that should be preserved, or as a for other reasons, other purposes. That these are all interesting things to explore and examine in some of the work going forward. And so, and I think Amanda's done that fairly well. So with that, I'm going to stop. Well, that's our broad conceptual framework, and come and turn everyone's volume on, if I can figure out how to do that, so that people can ask questions and that we can go from there. So give me 3 seconds to, you can unmute your piece, but I think if we have a little bit of discussion, that would be great. So some people have I can see have their stuff there. So Doug, you are off. Claire, Kara. So everyone is available to speak if they would like, or ask questions or make comments, and that would be very welcome. And if not, the next steps in this are for some of the people on this conference call to meet in June 2nd in Calgary as part of the Carbon Management Canada annual meeting, or just in advance of it. So the next steps are to see where we go from here and what to think about. But I'll stop talking for a minute and let people say what they'd like.
Yeah, Steve Stewart here. Could I ask a question of Amanda?
Sure.
Hi. So, thank you. Really interesting case studies, and I thought one of the really interesting things is that both of them seem to be about protecting something. They seem to be about protecting loss of farmland, or about, in the second case, in Priddis, about protecting nature. And I just wonder, in this idea of place, and if this is part of how we look at these public engagements, do you think that place and place attachment is always necessarily conservative, or something trying to keep change from happening to a community, to a place? Is that always an element of it? Does it have to be an element of it all the time?
Does it always have to be a conservation effort? Is
not so much a conservation effort, but trying to keep things the way they are, more conservative, kind of reactionary, even keeping change from happening to a community or to a place.
I wouldn't agree with that. I think a lot of times it is, such as in Priddis, where people wanted to keep the place natural. This actually can be seen more so in a third community that I studied, whereas and actually Weyburn too, where they were seeking out industry. So it was not that they wanted their place necessarily to stay the same visually, but they recognized the need that things might have to change, and that to keep the community around, there was going to have to be more development in the area. So you are right. They were protecting something. They were protecting jobs and their community's sustainability. But it doesn't always have to be like a conservation kind of thing. They can. Those two variables, community and place, I think factored into things very much. So and it interacted. So yeah. Does that answer your question?
It does, and I think it's very interesting. I just trying to think through the way that place works in these kind of situations. I mean, does a sense of attachment to a place, does that change? I mean, how do places change, and how do attachments to those places change? And I think that's got to be a big part of any of this kind of negotiating these new developments in places.
I agree.
Thanks, Drew.
This is Doug McDonald speaking. Can I ask a question?
Yes, Doug.
So just to continue this discussion, Amanda, I was hoping to put a question to you. I was quite intrigued, if I understood your presentation correctly, the same variable of perception of place in the two cases, the Weyburn and the Priddis, Alberta, led to two different responses.
Yes.
So why was that? What's your understanding of why there was why the difference in the two cases?
Well, it is interesting that there is that same variable, such as place, and it differed so much. And what I think it was that that variable interacted with other variables. So, in, for instance, uh, in Weyburn, the variable of place interacted with the variable of, for instance, that there's a long history of farming and living off of the land, and they needed to live. They needed oil development to continue to live off the land. I mean, I was talking to someone in 2011. There was that very big flood in the Weyburn area, if anyone remembers, and they said, you know, we have 4,000 acres of land. We were only able to plant 200. Thank goodness for the oil industry here. So place interacts with the other factors, and that can lead to different implications or different risk perceptions.
So that suggests that maybe these other factors are more important than sense of place in deciding response.
I'm not sure if more important, but because community sustainability was an important factor too in both places. However, they interacted differently as well. So it's just a series of different interactions with different variables.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Well, we'd we'd welcome any other comments or thoughts, but we don't want to keep everyone here all day. We certainly, I think what happens now is we take this recording and we'll post it adjacent to the other one and let people consider it and think on some of these things. But the next steps forward on this project is to figure out, how do we actually where do we tease out the comparisons? What sort of changes in terms of the cases that Amanda's done and the cases that have been done in British Columbia of Run in the River and with shale gas, where do we see the differences in terms of what's gone right and what's gone wrong, and what lessons can be learned in terms of the social responses and the way that these projects are proposed and put forward. So there's a lot to do in terms of this comparison going forward, and that's really the work that we have ahead of us. Kara, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, well, thanks to Amanda and Stephen and Lawrence for really interesting presentations. There's a lot more obvious overlap amongst the cases than I had anticipated. Actually, I knew that there was be some between wind and Run River, but the overlaps are a lot more complex, I think. And two that jump out at me are the question of scale of energy development, and how inherently different it is to look at something at the scale that the Muskrat Falls or shale gas development in the Northeast is, as opposed to these sort of located specific sorts of struggles where you do actually have this, the effects and the community engaged and more precise. And then the other one is like how we frame things temporally. So we can talk about some of your conclusions around the depth of engagement. If it's legally mandated and shallow, it's going to be problematic. If it's going to be, much more deep, it doesn't encourage anything. But the reactive nature of engagement in relationship to these developments is intriguing. And then with what Lawrence is doing and with what my students are doing at North this summer around how taking a step back and thinking about landscape scale planning can and can't provide a framework within which we can kind of think about this sort of energy development differently. So making it actually not just about an individual proponent engagement, but a wider scale of planning.
Yeah.
That might put the values of place and other values onto the landscape. I mean, we have a history of this in British Columbia. It's not being honored or respected or completed at the moment, but yeah, so just a kind of a tangle of issues I think that will be fun to untable when we meet and talk about it. But,
when we meet, there is a lot of overlap. I agree with Lawrence's and the work that you're beginning up in the Northeast. in terms of the community planning, this bottom-up idea, and the lessons to be learned from that. Okay, well, by my control panel, it tells me that we're at 60 minutes, and I don't want to. I want to respect everyone's time, and certainly thank you all for joining us. It's been this has been a good lesson for all of us in terms of technology and the potential for this sort of thing, and I think it's been a positive experience for me. Although I know some people in Victoria were frustrated that they did their people in Ontario, you may not have heard, they did their entire presentation without knowing that we had left them. And so as I was doing my presentation here today, I was actually in a bit of a panic that people had disappeared as well. But I was glad that Lawrence and others came on board when I was at the end. So they had a less positive experience at the beginning, but hopefully this is something that actually enables collaboration across multiple teams and multiple places in a more efficient and certainly lower carbon way than we have in the past. Okay, well, with that, thank you very much to everyone, and enjoy the weekend and enjoy the afternoon.
Thank you, Stephen.
Yes, thank you, Doug. Bye now.